Hello and welcome back to Top Shelf Books. If you have been listening along with us, I do thank you. If you're joining us for the first time, this is our little book podcast, and I'll be introducing you to books that are kind of common or foundational on a particular topic, but hopefully I'll also be introducing you to something that's a little more obscure and expanding your TBR. You can follow all of my books if you are interested in doing so on Tumblr at Books in Piles. Welcome to episode 4, which is about trees. Let me tell you why. So, I did an episode about leaves. And in researching leaves, which you would think would be a fairly niche topic and not that complicated, I lost the forest for the trees. I found the forest for the leaves. I found more books, lots more books. So here we are again talking about trees. And again, hopefully you will find something of interest. I generally include both nonfiction and fiction titles, so whatever your pleasure, I hope you find something to enjoy. In undergrad, I had a favorite history professor. And in fact, I took so many of his classes that his wife was really happy when I got engaged because she seemed to have theorized that I was stalking this gentleman. Never was, promise, just liked history. It was a small campus. There were only a couple of professors that taught any particular topic. But I mention this beloved professor because he used to tell us that historians had the bone removed from their skulls that allowed them to actually begin any history course anywhere near the time period that it covered. Now that I am a professor myself, I would like to modify that and say that no professor can actually talk about anything without talking about something else first. So even though today's topic is trees, let me first introduce you to some plants. This is an amazing amalgamation of titles, so depending on where you want to dive in, very different. The life of plants actually deals with metaphysics, so if you're thinking, what I really need is plants and philosophy, that's the road that you want to go. If you want to see some of the early writings on plants, then you want the Metamorphosis of Plants, which is in the public domain, so you can pick it up for free. For my money, I would start with What a Plant Knows, where you will discover what plants can sense about their environment. This will change how you pick flowers for the rest of your life. It talks about what plants experience in space, for example. Did you know we sent plants to space? We have. Plants and planets together for the very first time. Maybe not for the very first time, but really fascinating book. I taught it to my students in a course about the environment and wisdom, and they tried some of the different activities in the text. So a really, really fun introduction to just sort of how plants experience their world. So, how did we get all of the plants in our lives that we take for granted? You hear a lot now about invasive species and planting local plants, things like that. Well, initially there was a great deal of fuss made about collecting exotic plants, which you can read about in Chasing Plants or the Plant Hunter's Atlas, which is beautifully illustrated with museum prints from the Royal Botanic Gardens. And then Hortus Curious is a gorgeous book, partially for its bright pink color, but it takes us into the world of really unusual plants. So even if you are someone that is really well versed in gardening, I am not. Plants commit suicide in my presence. They give up immediately, but I do like to read about them. So Hortus Curious, going to show you some different plants maybe than the ones you are cultivating. All right, well, I did promise you trees, so let's get to the trees. And the trees, of course, you will find in the forest. So I wanted to give you an overview of some of the different forests that cover our Earth, including old growth forest. If you were not aware that most of the forests in the United States are actually second growth, they've been timbered, this is worth looking into in your area because the trees that we have now, as big and as beautiful as some of those are, they could have been bigger and more beautiful yet. And one of the things I would like to give credit to my lovely state, we have the biggest tulip poplar, I believe, in the United States. Its location is kept secret so that no one can cut it down, because unfortunately, when you have the biggest and most beautiful of something, there will always be someone that wishes to destroy it. I could not find a wonderful book on mangrove forests, so I'm giving you a wonderful book on tigers in mangrove forests in the Sundarbans, because the two live in sort of sympathy with one another, although the tigers do eat people, worth watching out for. Also, boreal forests and urban forests, so some of the places that you can find wonderful trees. Still more places to find wonderful trees: rainforest, jungles, seaweed or kelp forests, and Arctic forests. I will warn you that Arctic forest is incredibly expensive. I could not find an affordable volume for this one. So if anyone has any suggestions for Arctic forest reading that is not $400, please let me know. So why should we care so much about the trees that surround us? Not just because we did an episode on leaves and it led us in the direction of the trees, but how are they important to our world? Unless you have perhaps been living inside a tree, which some people in Appalachia famously have done, have lived inside some giant trees. There's some beautiful articles out there on this. If you've not investigated it, definitely worth looking at. Well, if you've not been living in those trees, you've probably heard that we're experiencing climate change issues, and trees are one of the best ways to combat those things. So planting trees, nurturing trees, protecting trees, and the Arbornaut takes us into the treetops for that experience. A forest journey connects us with how trees have shaped human experience and also how we have shaped the forests and trees in our world. Bernd Heinrich, his The Trees in My Forest, is kind of a more personal, close-up look at the trees he's surrounded by. I love his writing, though. If you've not experienced his writing, he has several natural history books. Very, very lovely. The Ravens are my favorite. For some general information on trees, the Oxford Encyclopedia of Trees of the World, and maybe you're sitting here thinking, why do I need general information on trees? Let me propose something to you. This is what I propose to my students sometimes when we're talking about natural history or conservation. If an insect flies past you and you just see a little black blur or a little black dot, you don't feel much compunction about swatting it or killing it. But if you know what it is and you know about its life cycle and you know the things that it does and how it impacts the world, you might feel differently. Many of us are surrounded by wonderful things all the time: birds, plants, insects. When you know them, when you know their names, when you know how they exist and how they contribute to the environment, it really changes our relationship to them. So I think this is an important thing, and it just makes your life richer when you are going, maybe driving down the road, and you can say, well, that's an oak, that's a maple, which most people can do, some of the most common or popular trees. But once you start to see others, the tulip poplar I mentioned, those are my favorite. I love their unusual and sticky flowers. But once I knew how to recognize them, I saw them all over the place. So that's a good reason for general knowledge. If you're looking for something a little more adventurous, the Wild Trees deals with the exploration of those giant redwoods out west. I just mentioned tree identification. If you want to brush up on your identification, forest forensics and how to read a tree can help you with that. And the World Atlas of Trees and Forests can tell you where our forests are, how they are functioning. I've seen them called the lungs of the planet, these great forested landscapes. So it's good to know where those wonderful lungs are, helping us, sustaining the planet. So call this my little encouragement to both learn where they are and maybe plant some trees. Naturally, once I started looking into books to share with you about trees, I got into parts of trees. This maybe tells you more about how my mind works than you wanted to know. Uh, so here are some books on seeds, which obviously very important to us. And you know that there's a great deal of controversy about what seeds people are allowed to save in agriculture. You know, the companies that have what's the word I want? The companies that have sort of copyrighted certain seeds or made them impossible to reproduce. Some photography here about what happens to trees after they die, and then all of the things that rely upon a tree, you know, from the birds that nest there to the insects that get under the bark, all those sorts of things. Again, good to acquaint yourself with your natural environment, to learn who you share space with. And of course, one of the parts of trees that we are most familiar with on our kitchen counters, fruit. If you're like me, you bring it home and it sits there and then you throw it away because you like chocolate. But I did want to share with you some of the books that chart how particular foods get into our lives. And this is one of the places where I think most people can see just how global our lives have become. You know, the foods that we can get access to all year round, kind of amazing. So some information about that, as well as some information about foraging. Of course, please do this safely. Do not poison yourself in the search for wild food, and some recipe books as well. You probably haven't thought a great deal about how the culture of trees connects to your life, but if you are inside your house listening, you might look around at all of the wood products that surround you. You might also think of the food and the medicine that comes from trees. So books like The Sugar Season and Planet Palm talk about those. And then, you know, all of the things that we eat and drink, how, you know, these trace back to plants. So we are very much connected to plant life into trees and indebted to them in our daily lives. All right, time for a personal story. I know you've been dying for one. I just thought of this as I was thinking about how our lives intersect with trees. My family was in a flash flood when I was 4 years old, and as we tried to escape our trailer, which was being torn apart by floodwaters, if you've experienced a flash flood, you know just how quickly and how violently they arise. As the trailer was torn apart, we couldn't get to our car in time, and the trailer sat in a valley. So even if we'd gotten to the car, we probably couldn't have outrun the water out of the valley. My mom, my stepdad, my sister, and I ended up in a tree, and our lives were saved because of a tree. So that is an unexpected connection between my life and all of these trees I'm talking about. And the thing that's so amazing about that story, for one, that our parents were able to get us through this water and into the trees in safety. I was up there with my sister by myself for a time, and I do remember thinking, I hope someone gets up here because I can't take care of a baby. She was a baby, and my mom was 8 months pregnant with my brother at the time as well. But the amazing thing is the tree that held us and survived was so much smaller than the other great big trees in our yard that got washed away. So I suppose I dedicate this episode to that hardy, plucky survival tree. Unfortunately, our relationships with trees have not always been good. So some text here about how we have taken advantage of the environment and also the legal ramifications of that. I love John Valen's writing especially, so recommend him to you sort of at the top of the list, but all wonderful works about how we take the bounty of the earth, what we do with it, and sort of what the punishments should be when people do these things. Some further destruction. This is unfortunately always part of human history and human interaction with the environment. It's always there is a component of destruction, it seems, before we realize what we've done. I did not know about the timber logging and the intimidation and things associated with that and money logging. If you are interested in nature documentaries. There's some wonderful work out there about the nature that is surprisingly flourishing in both the DMZ and Chernobyl. So something to think about. Sometimes in our destruction, we create strange reservoirs for things to flourish, just not necessarily what was flourishing there before. I've been trying to privilege for you in each of these episodes voices that may have been left out of the discussion before. So soil, you're going to see some exploration of race, and then fresh banana leaves, an indigenous perspective. The more famous work from the indigenous point of view is braiding sweetgrass, and there are many, many books out there that suggest indigenous engagement with the world for healing a lot of the problems associated with climate change. So you can find lots of work that fit under that umbrella. If you have others that you think should be included in this list, please do let me know, because I would love to expand it. I mentioned trees as part of the material out of which we make up the furniture, the homes, the items we live in and engage with. Also from trees, we make some of our ultimate symbols. So the cross, for example. And when I found the title, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which is looking at Black spirituality and reshaping the ugly symbol of the lynching tree, I thought of Christ's body and the cross that speaks in the poem The Dream of the Rood. So I thought that these two would live very happily together. So if you've not experienced either one, you might want to start with the poem and hear what the cross has to say about being invited into, involved in the murder of Christ. So some spirituality and some race to think about with these titles. If I asked you to close your eyes and to imagine a forest, to picture yourself in a forested landscape, I wonder if you would experience the comfort and the peace of nature that some people experience, or if there would be an eeriness. There is a human association with fear in the forest, mostly because we're visual creatures and forested landscapes make it very difficult to see. Folks that have read Pet Sematary, for my money, some of the creepiest moments in that book have to do with crawling over that dead wood and not being able to see what's ahead or behind and hearing the noises. I've been out in the woods at night, and the sounds that surround you and how they're magnified. A deer can sound very frightening at 3 in the morning, even if the logical part of your brain knows that's what you're hearing. So, of course, forests really feature in our folklore, in our fairy tales, things like Grimm's fairy tales. So I wanted to include some of that here, as well as folklore associated with medicine and folklore associated with witchcraft. Obviously, not encouraging you to use any botanical poison on anyone. This is for historical use, not for practical use. Even though it's near Halloween, don't go poisoning anyone. Some more folklore for you, one specifically looking at fairy tales. The Alexander Porteous book is from 1928, so you can get a much older perspective on those ideas about the forest in fairy tales and folklore. And then Greening the Paranormal just really kind of surprised me as a combination of ideas. So something that was new to me in the world of folklore, why not? We're greening everything else. So when I asked you to close your eyes and imagine the forest, I mentioned it as potentially healing. And I taught a course to my students, and I mentioned to you about nature and wisdom and health. And 10 minutes outside, 10 minutes in nature can do a wonderful array of things to your body, can lower your stress level, lower your blood pressure. 10 minutes, that's a really small investment, but most of us don't put that into our days. We just don't have time. So I wanted to offer you some books to maybe rethink that aspect of your life. So forest therapy is nice because it describes things that you can do in nature, but it also takes into account that sometimes it's very cold, sometimes it's very miserable, and you don't want to be out there. Although if you have read the book 52 Ways to Walk there are benefits to walking in the cold and in miserable weather, so don't count it completely out. But aspects of nature that can help and heal you, forest bathing, for example. Journey with Plant Spirits is a little more in the folklore, natural healing realm, but I wanted to include it as well. And then tree climbing also focuses on that well-being and how we can absorb well-being from nature, as well as looking at trees in literature and in art. For those of you who have been utterly bored by all of that nonfiction and need something else, on we go. So some poetry here with the Echoing Green, a collection of stories. I have not been able to acquire The Plant Hunter yet because it was published overseas. I'm working on adding it to my collection. If you've not read Edward Rutherford, he likes to write very dense, multi-generational stories. This one is focusing on an English forest and all of the cast and characters that take place there. If you liked Pillars of the Earth, then Edward Rutherford is for you. I mentioned previously that part of the human history of engaging with the natural world always has to do with destruction. Unfortunate, but true. And here's a collection of fiction that deals primarily with logging, with trying to save trees. And there are some articles out there that talk about these books were originally imagined as fiction, but some of them have come true in this age of global warming, climate change, environmental destruction. People are fighting to keep nature in their lives and the lives of their children and grandchildren. I will mention for Serena that very popular book. I love the creation of her character. She's almost a goddess figure, but I feel like the story never lives up to the creation of the character. So I will leave that one up to you in your own reading, but that is a personal note of disappointment for me in that book. If you're needing a little bit of fantasy or fiction in your reading, a recent publication, A Summer of the Forest Folk. I wanted to highlight this one because it is an unusual publication in the sense that it has aspects of transness, of queerness that you don't see in other fantasy. It was a very unique reading experience, so I recommend it for the uniqueness. It feels like a fairy tale. Very unusual. I love Ray Bradbury. You'll see me mention him again. And the Scythe is sort of an engagement with nature, not specifically with trees, but with growing and dying in the harvest. The Butcher of the Forest has not yet been released, but it looks like an interesting fantasy fairy tale with that sort of forest. And I haven't included it here, but for the opening part of it, I feel like I should mention The Last Unicorn. I love its focus on the forest and the idea of returning to the forest as an almost Edenic space for the immortal unicorns. So something worth thinking about. I'm such a sucker for horror and mystery books, which is hilarious because I'm also scared of everything all the time. It's my nature. But I do love a good killer plant book. I also love killer animal books. I will share those with you in another. I have so many pulp killer animal books. They're ridiculous and hilarious. And I have to be honest with you, dear reader, I root for the animals every time. I know that's not nice, but it's true. So here are some plant horror books and my absolute favorite tree in literature, the Halloween tree. And it is the time of year for the Halloween tree. More horror and mystery for you. The Suicide Forest is of course based on the real thing, which is a very sad phenomenon. If you've not taken a look at that, obviously you don't want to cause any triggering for anyone, but it is a real thing if you want to do any research on that. A recent publication that does kind of tread into that fairy tale territory of Snow White and the Apple is Black River Orchard by Chuck Wendig. If you are a writer, I do recommend checking out his blog. I love his writing advice. It's very hilarious, very tongue-in-cheek. All right, once more we have reached the credits. So thank you for exploring the literary world of trees with me today. I hope that you found something to add to your reading life. I always want to hear from you, so you can reach me at navalianlibrary@gmail.com. You can follow me on Tumblr at Books and Piles, or you can leave me comments here. As always, I have tried to give you a list of the books featured in today's discussion. Please support your local and indie book dealers. And of course, pass books on to those that you love. Books should have many, many lives. Trees died for them, you know. I have got to come up with some sort of cute way to end these things because there are so many slides about more books. So if you have suggestions for a little jingle, I can't sing, but give me something. I don't know. Maybe I can get the cats to talk to you. Still more books, reminding you, or if you're new to this adventure, they do follow the order that they are discussed in. So that is as elaborate as all of that gets. More books for you on trees and fruit. More books on fruit, culture, and environmental discussion. Today's books on destruction as well as race and culture. Today's selection on books that we can heal ourselves with, healing books, and finally some fiction. And our final selection of books. Thank you again for spending time with me today. I hope that you found something to add to your reading pile. Wishing you a wonderful day and lots of things to read.